Okay, so Christopher Pepper is with us today. He is a best-selling Substack author in the parenting category. He's an award-winning health educator, speaker, and writer. His new book, Talk to Your Boys with Joanna Schroeder, is now available for pre-order. So check that out and check out his Substack, Teen Health Today. And this is a conversation often about gender. And so I'm super interested in, just because this is like something I write about, and I just think it's really interesting what's going on with teen boys. And, Gwen is a mother of a boy and a grandmother of two boys.
Three boys. And
Three boys.
Right now, it's kind of the time that I'm thinking. There's 7 and 8.
Wow.
Perfect time to know what's happening. And I think it's really interesting. Like, I read Boy Mom, and I read by Ruth Whitman, another Substacker, and then I read Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. He also has a great Substack through the Young Men's Research Initiative. And I really liked what they had to say. I think, Christopher, you bring a slightly different perspective as like an expert on teen health and wellness, and somebody who's also kind of giving, I think, Richard Reeves is looking at it from more of a policy perspective. I think Ruth Whitman is doing it from it's less of like advice to parents. It is definitely that, but it's also just kind of like memoir, sociology. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here.
Awesome. I really liked your talk at the Aspen event.
Mm-hmm.
I watched the video of that, the panel discussion. Yeah, no, it was really good. What is the Aspen event? Like, how did that happen?
So there's a big festival called the Aspen Ideas Festival that's in Aspen, Colorado every summer. And it's popular enough they actually run two sessions. So I think each of those is 5 or 6 days long. And it's just concluding right now. So there's 2 sessions of the Aspen Ideas Festival. But right before the Aspen Ideas Festival, there's this alternative festival run by the same people on the same grounds, called the Aspen Ideas Health Festival. And it's really, some folks who were talking to me about it said, "Oh, this is the little bit more scientific, a little more nerdy," and it's slightly shorter. So it started on a Sunday afternoon and went until Wednesday at noon. And people gather in Aspen, Colorado, to hear big ideas about health and healthcare, mental health, a lot of talk about AI and how AI might affect people's health or be a useful tool or a harmful tool, just a lot of sort of big thinking about ideas. So it was great to be there in person. I was a panelist, so I got to attend the whole event and meet a lot of people. It was really nice to be there. But one thing I appreciate about it is that they have a professional video crew in the back of each session, and the sessions are mostly held in tents or in buildings, but they have a recording crew, and almost instantaneously the sessions go up on YouTube. So
That's nice.
you can watch them for free. The panel that I was on is available on YouTube to watch. And I was on a panel with Lisa Damore and Sema Sagar, and we talked about youth mental health, and went really well.
Yeah, I thought it was great. And who puts it on?
It's a nonprofit organization called the Aspen Institute.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a worldwide, really prestigious thing. I mean, if I'm getting this right, like people like Fareed Zakaria are there, and international policymakers and experts on all these things. It's a like a huge thing.
Yeah, it is. It was a real honor to be invited to go.
Yeah.
And it was a great place to meet people. For people who are attending, I think if you really enjoy TED Talks or city arts and lectures kind of type events, and you want to have a vacation where you get to go to those back to back to back, this
Mhm.
is it's the place for you.
So I want to take a step back a little bit and just talk about like why teen boys?
Sure. So, I mean, I was a teen boy. I am visiting my family in Wisconsin right now, where I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and um, really, sometimes when I'm here on vacation, I reflect on like what was it like when I was a teenager growing up. And I did not. I usually tried to avoid things where there were a lot of boys, avoid the football team and the drunken parties and things like that. That was not my scene. And I had a friend when I was a senior in high school. I had a friend who was a girl who was an artist and um, won an award from for her artwork, and it was going to be displayed in a special um, s- special display somewhere. And I said, "Oh, can I see your artwork?" Um, and she had it, and took me into the place where she had it hung up. And then kind of, and it was kind of a disturbing artwork, but it was a little hard to understand what it was about. And I asked her more about it, like where did this come from? And she ended up disclosing to me that she'd been sexually assaulted, and told me a really personal story about that. And as a 17-year-old, that was something that just really affected me. And when I went to college at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, and just kind of that was I made a promise to myself when I was at like when I go to college, this will be like something that I focus on, and it was. I went and volunteered for all 4 years that I was in college at the rape education office, which was um, not was housed within the women's center at the school. A sign of the times in the 90s. That's where kind of things where they really rape and sexual assault were really thought of as a women's issue, and that was something that was largely left for women to deal with and solve. And um, I was one of the few men who had kind of gone through their training and was on the list of people who could go out and speak to the public. Um, and so I got often sent to fraternities or all male spaces. And we had a script to follow that was of what to say. And when I look back on it now, I'm like, oh, it was a really hard sell because everything that we kind of, if you go in to do a lecture about rape, it was just a lot of no's, like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. This will get the police called. And I just think it's hard to get any audience engaged in something when it's all framed as a negative or a list of rules. And I'm really grateful for how much the language around consent and um, a more collaborative view of sexuality and sexual negotiations has how much that's evolved over the last few decades.
Around what time was this?
That was in the early 90s. So I was in college from 1993 to 1997, and a lot of Take Back the Night marches, a lot of like, um, I took a lot of women's studies classes in college, but it feels pretty distant from where we are now.
Tell me more about why, if you're comfortable talking about it, why you avoided teen boys when you were a teen boy.
Oh, fear. I mean, largely like fear of violence. Um, and that I think there's just such a to kind of fit in and be accepted. There's such a code of how to act that it felt very kind of restricted and hard to move around. So people would make fun of you for like, oh, your voice sounds funny. Your voice sounds effeminate. You're holding your wrist the wrong way. You must be gay. Like, um, thinking about what clothes you wear, thinking about um, just kind of daily freedom to be a person in the world felt very um, policed, I guess, and by other boys with and the usual accusations were like, "Oh, you're too feminine, you're girly, or you're gay," and sometimes that was accompanied by words. Usually, it's accompanied by words or teasing, and then sometimes people would beat you up or threaten to beat you up, and that was not, I grew up with a feminist mom and a lot of talk about gender in the home, and really learned from my family about gender equality as an ideal. And that was just not my didn't feel like a comfortable space to be.
Thank you for sharing that. I think one thing that's been really interesting, like I guess I first really thought about it reading Richard Reeves' book, is that he takes some time to write about when he started to focus in on boys and advocate for boys. He got a lot of pushback from feminists, particularly on the left, and Democrats who would say, girls haven't even like reached equality. Like, why would you advocate for boys in a situation where girls still need all this help? And it just seemed like part of the, you're choosing to become part of the problem by advocating for boys. And obviously, I disagree with that. I see where they're coming from, certainly, and I don't think it's without merit to look at like the ecosystem, but at the same time, as you're kind of pointing out, and there's so much I want to talk about, and it's hard to know what order to do it in, but we can't have liberation while, um, half the population suffers, regardless of which half it is, and that gender oppresses us all. But one thing that's really been useful, like I grew up, my parents divorced when I was 8. I spent every weekend with my dad, but like I also had, I have 3 sisters, and he was married to my stepmom, and so I don't have any brothers. I wasn't close to any cousins. Like the extent to which I have been isolated from like the male experience is pretty intense. Um, and so, and I was a weird kid. I was made fun of a little bit. I was ostracized a little bit. But like when I hear about what it's like to grow up male in the US in terms of like maybe people would make fun of you, but nobody's gonna was gonna beat me up for for failing to perform anything, much less my gender. I just think it's really interesting and important to talk about, like, when we talk about why do boys do X, Y, or Z, that's like obviously regressive, obviously hurtful, obviously problematic. It's like because other boys will literally beat them up if they don't.
Yeah.
like um like actual violence is on the line here, or at least the credible threat thereof. And so asking individual boys to like violate patriarchal gender norms on their own, like we're only going to get so far.
Yeah, I agree. I think what I'm interested in is kind of more freedom for everyone. And I think we've seen that that's a problem with girls, and there's been targeted programs to say, you can be an engineer, you can be a computer programmer. Um, all these options that used to be blocked off for girls and women are now open, and we want you to pursue them. And want you to see yourself being able to be successful in those ways. And I think those programs are great. Like I want those programs to continue to have girls go into STEM programs and to really be looking at like where places where there are disparities, and where we could have more women in careers that have been coded masculine in the past. I think we should be doing that, and to make it so that people, girls can be have a range of gender expression, that they can, act really girly and feminine. They can act masculine and be a tomboy, or have all those be acceptable ways to be in the world. And I want the same thing for boys. Like I want it to be okay to, um, to wear what you want, to paint your nails if you want, to be in the choir or be in ballet, um, just as much as it is okay to play baseball or football or brag about your high score in video games. And and then to have a range of career options, and I think especially with jobs that where you're caring for other people, because so many of the jobs that we think of as like manly jobs are, making something with your hands or banging on things or doing something really technical, like sitting at a computer for 8 hours a day and figuring out code. And those are fine jobs, but I think there's a lot of boys who would really enjoy and be successful in jobs where they're um, taking care of other people, being spending their days being kind and
Yep.
thoughtful towards others, and
Totally.
those don't always feel open.
No, because I mean, the more that I think about it and read about it and talk to people about it, I really believe that, and I say this not because I think it should be a competition, but just to like get people's thoughts going. I think that we discourage, stigmatize, punish men and boys for failing to perform hegemonic masculinity way more than we stigmatize, discourage, punish girls and women for failing to perform, default femininity.
Well, absolutely. In my observation, so as I've said many times, so I graduated in high school in 1979, and I have now grandchildren in elementary school. I think the range for girls, even when I was in school, to dress a certain way. My sister, I have a twin sister, she called them clodhoppers, but they were like hiking boots with big chunky soles and, Levi cords and baggy shirts. So I think the range is way broader and has been for lots of decades for women to self-expression in terms of clothing. Careers were a little slower and harder, but that I think has been, we've talked about education and women in careers, that the range for women to behave in our society is much wider. And in terms of personal expression, clothing, fashion, makeup, hairstyles, all of that, I think it's much narrower, still continues to be much narrower for men. And the penalty, as you said, is often still violence.
Yeah, like if a woman dresses like a man, it's cute. If a woman has a deep voice, it's sexy. If a man dresses like a woman or has an effeminate voice, he might get beat up. Like,
Yeah.
it's totally different. In a way that I think it's hard to appreciate if you're not experiencing it, if you've never experienced it. And one thing, I just read Liz Planck's For the Love of Men, and she made plain to me something I'd suspected and kind of experienced but hadn't put words to, which is that not only are men like super punished for failing to perform masculinity or performing femininity, which are the same, but they don't even have like the tools to talk about it. Like if you like, it's not like they're like consciously aware and conversant in this pressure and in this expectation and how it negatively impacts their life, which makes everything much harder.
Yeah, I think that time where people usually pick up these guidelines around how to act, it's sort of act manly, act like a man kind of um, terms that we use is usually in elementary school or middle school, um, and there's not a guidebook. Nobody gives you a set of rules for how to do that. It's people are
Well,
interpreting
it's
on
the biggest, dumbest, meanest bully on the playground.
yeah.
Like, that's who
Oh,
sets
yeah,
the norms.
because where it's the biggest risk, right? If the biggest
Right.
risk is this kid who's going to beat you up or at the least tease you and get the other boys to not like you, that becomes the guide, right? I have
But
to
it's girls and women too, right? Like girls and women, if I have a deep voice and dress like a man, like a man will still have sex with me. Like that's just how it is. Like it's supply and demand. For men who perform femininity. It's just harder for men to get sex generally. And so and obviously there are all kinds of people who like all kinds of things, but there are penalties from other boys and from girls for men to violate gender norms that aren't the same for women and girls when we do it.
I think that comes up especially around that middle school age where people are figuring out their own identity and their place in the world. Um, and for many people, that's the time in life where they feel the most insecure um, about their physical body. That's their body's changing right around them, their brain is changing, their sense of place in the world changes, and often there's a big school change where people go from an elementary school to a middle school with different people and different adults around who don't know them. Um, so that is a time where a lot of these issues really come up.
Totally. So one thing that's also been really interesting is like the extent to which parents perpetuate gendered expectations, perpetuate gender. And I'm not a parent, thank God. And so I don't obviously like know how to do it. And I feel a lot of empathy for parents. And I think on the one hand, it's kind of malpractice to not prepare your children for a gendered society, especially when failing to perform gender can result in violence. Like to not teach any of that seems a little bit neglectful, but then you also don't want to perpetuate it necessarily too much yourself. So like that's one thing I like about what you're doing in terms of like here is advice for parents. So obviously like you've written a whole book about it. I don't expect you to regurgitate the book on this little conversation, but like yeah, what are some tips for parents to thread that needle of like keeping your kids safe but not unaware of, unconscious of how messed up our society is?
Thank you. So, yeah, I have a book called Talk to Your Boys that I wrote with Joanna Schroeder. It'll come out 2 months from today on September 9th. And it is
Available
16,
for pre-order.
you can pre order it. It's 16 chapters, and each chapter talks about a different topic. So, um, the idea for us was to write a book that was kind of a guide for how to have meaningful conversations about these things that are challenging to talk about. So there's a chapter on talk to your boys about consent. There's a chapter about talk to your boys about violence and guns. Um, there's a whole chapter about porn. And each of those things are like, and another chapter about drugs and substance use. And I know from talking to parents, like these are topics that everybody's like, I know I need to talk about that or I should talk about it. But often what I see is that people are like, maybe they'll learn that in school, or I'll talk to him about it if it comes up. Um, or I feel like he's maybe too young. I don't want to bring it up. And often the conversations, even with good intentions, those conversations never really happen or happen in a very surface level way. And I think we're seeing the harms that when we look at what's happening with young men right now, we're seeing some harms that come from not having those conversations.
Mhm.
Um, and that is really, for me, it feels like a call to action. Like, actually, we have to kind of embrace the awkwardness and talk about these things, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it feels like it's going to be hard. So the book is meant to be a guide to how to do that with a little bit to make it a little easier by having some scripts and some tips for how to do things from experts. But um, it's the conversations are still going to be awkward. um, but it's important to have them, and that's where you set your values. There's lots of data that says that parents or the caregivers in the home are the real the people who have biggest influence on young people um, of anyone in their life. So it's much more likely, bigger influence than teachers or coaches or counselors. And kids in the home are looking at how you live your life and what you do day by day, and they're also listening to what you say and the values that you share with them. And as young people get older, um, we want to encourage those kind of critical thinking skills of, thinking about the world. You're going to encounter things that are surprising or new or unexpected, and have to figure out how to deal with them. And practicing those skills and talking about those things in a thoughtful way, and trying to connect with like the values for kind of what kind of person do you want to be in the world? How do you want to treat other people? Trying to connect with those over time. Um, it's important. And kids are going to make mistakes. Teenagers are going to do things that they regret. But having a chance to reflect on them and saying, next time I would do that a different way, or sometimes it's just observing someone else, and it can be on a TV show or a movie. Like, how did you think about how that boyfriend treated the girlfriend in the show that we just watched?
Mhm.
And you can talk about that and say, and then when they're actually having relationships in their real life, they that'll be in there somewhere, and those discussions all build up to the person that they're going to be in the world.
I feel like I'm almost 40, and I look back at my childhood, and I just, like, had a lot of conversations with my mom. Like, we just talked a lot, and I think I mean, we enjoy talking to each other, um, but there was also just, like, not a lot else to do. Like, I didn't have a phone to scroll. I wasn't like, she forced me to be part of one extracurricular activity at all times, but I was only in one, it only took up so much time, and so I feel like this exhortation to talk to your kids is like, obviously these conversations were always awkward, but there was just a lot of space for them to happen that I feel like has really condensed down with all the extracurriculars and phones and screens and tutoring and just everything that's like taken up that space.
Well, people worry a lot about what kids are seeing online, and I think there's some legitimate concerns around what kind of influences they're, what the material that they're seeing, what kind of influence that's having on them. Um, I don't think that we're paying quite enough attention to just the amount of time that is crowded out by
Right,
phones. So basically, what you're talking about there is kind of, there's a lot of empty time. There's time where you're together and there's no distraction.
right.
And those conversations are easier. It's easier to have those kind of conversations when there's some empty space to for them to happen. Um, I think now it, it is very common for both adults and kids to have their phones out at any time that there's a slight feeling of boredom, or there's nothing going on. Everybody's got their phone out. They're having their own individual experience, and that means that if you want to have challenging conversations, you have to work your way around that in a way that that's different than it was in the past.
Mhm.
Um,
It's also, if I had a question, it was like, okay, I could wait until I was back at school. I could call a friend, or I could ask my mom. But I couldn't just go to Reddit. Like, I couldn't just go to YouTube. So, of course, like, I asked my mom a bunch of stuff that, like, probably a teenager now is not gonna do. They're gonna avoid that discomfort. And, I don't know. Going back to the porn thing, like, this is something I'm pretty I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about, and it just seems to me like, looking at the bulk of the evidence, it seems very much like the Tipper Gore, violent movies and video games moral panic of the 90s. I'm not saying that violent video games and movies, don't contribute to certain people's, real life violent tendencies. Like, that happens, but on average, if you look at the cumulative effect, um, you don't. And with online porn, like, as these things proliferated, like, violence in the United States, rates of violence actually decreased. So it's hard to look at it and say, like, "Oh, it's caused a lot of violence." And so I kinda have the same assumption about porn, and from the research I've seen, that's kind of borne that out. Um, to me, like, the problem with porn seems much more that it's the only source of information for a lot of these kids, right? Like,
Can I
they're not
jump on that for just a sec? 'Cause because, Christopher, I was looking at your Substack, and you have links to some of the people that you're working with, and the I think the thing that impressed me was how to give young people the tools. They're going to look at porn, right? When I was a kid, people my age when we were kids, they'd get their dad's Playboy magazine
Yeah.
or whatever. So they're going to see, that's just what teenage boys do, teenage girls too, but it's giving them the tools to look at what to assess what they're looking at in terms of things. I think what I read on the Substack was things like consent and violence and those kind of things, how to look at it more critically so that so that you know what the right model might be in real life.
I think that's right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, I mean, with younger kids, we do sometimes see very young children coming across porn, and I think in those cases, like, you just want to keep them away from it because
Yeah.
it can be scary. Like, they saw these people, they're like, they're making weird noises. Are they hurting each other? It just doesn't
Mhm.
make sense if a 6 year old is looking at porn. You just want to figure out how to prevent that from happening again. You don't have to freak out and think that their whole life is going to be ruined, but um, you do
Yeah.
want to take active steps to say, okay, we left some options open that we want to close.
Yeah.
Um, with older with older teenagers, I think you're totally right that if they have access to the internet, they are going to see porn, and um, that is the reality of the world that we're in right now. Um, And the tool that seems to be most useful for teenagers and seems to be the one that we've been able to actually have schools accept as something that we can actually teach about in a classroom setting, or that parents can latch onto and say, okay, I could actually see myself sitting down and talking about that with a young person,
Mhm.
is media literacy. And it's those skills you were sort of referencing of, and you can use these skills for looking at an HBO TV show, or a movie that has some sexually explicit scenes, even if it's not porn, it's something that's erotic or is meant to be arousing, or just a sexual situation in a Hollywood film, or even in a commercial. A lot of commercials lean on sexual tropes, and you're basically looking at, like, who made this, um, what is the message they're trying to send, what's the purpose of it. You're thinking about, in the case of sexual situations, like, do you have any sense of whether the participants were willingly participating, um, or were they paid for their work, things like that. And then thinking about what's left out, and that's largely when I'm thinking about what you were referencing, like, um, that sometimes people learn from porn because it's their only source of sex education, and typically teenagers are looking at porn on tube sites where there's short little clips that usually you don't see people talking about birth control. You don't see talk about sexually transmitted infections or consent, where people are sitting down and saying, "Here's what I'd like to do. Here's what I'd like to do," and um, negotiating that out. All of that happens that happens separately before the cameras start rolling, and so it's kind of like, uh, you're just cutting to the action part where sexual activity is happening, and you don't see much happening afterwards. Like, once, um, often once there's an ejaculation or an orgasm, there's the scene is done, and you don't see people caring for one another afterwards. You don't see the kind of awkward situations that happen in real life when people are getting together, of somebody running to the bathroom or saying, "I'm hungry," or "I've got a cramp in my leg," or whatever. Um, so if that is the only source of information about, like, how does sex work, then young people are going to take that in, and when they are actually in the room with another person, it makes sense they would try to act out what they've seen because that's their source of education. So I think we both need to do media literacy and kind of robust sex education where we um, provide information that's not porn, about how sex works and how bodies change, and to help people understand sexuality in a bigger context. Um, and all of that helps when when young people see porn, it helps them put it in context so that they're not drawing all of their information just from that one source.
Totally. And how is that going in the era of Moms for Liberty, the media literacy?
Uh, I mean, so what happens with sex education in the United States is that it's extremely varied from place to place. Um, where we have lots of evidence that comprehensive sex education reduces sexual activity overall, causes delayed onset of sexual activity. But like, if you actually are interested in young people delaying sexual activity and using birth control and safe sex methods more often, and reducing teen pregnancy, reducing abortion, reducing um, risk taking behavior overall, you would want to
And
do,
sexual assault.
yeah, all of those things. You'd want to do as much sex education as possible. That's what the evidence shows. Um, we it is implemented in a very differently from place to place. So if you were looking at a physics class and you went to Alabama and then you went to Oregon and you went to Iowa and you went to Massachusetts, they pretty much look the same from place to place. They're not
Mhm.
dramatically different. If you went looking for sex education and went to Oregon, you went to all those same states, and you looked at what are people teaching. They're going to be different in each state, and some places don't teach it at all or teach incorrect information that's actually not factually true. Um, and lean a lot. Some places lean a lot on scare tactics.
Do you think that these people who, evangelical Christian nationalists, let's just call it what it is, who advocated for only offering federal funding for abstinence only sex education, who uh, try to make sure that kids can't access sex education in libraries, um, who try to censor, what teachers can tell children about their bodies. Do you think they don't know that they're setting their kids up to be more likely to be raped, or do you think that's like a trade-off they're willing to make?
Um, I when I try to connect with parents, I think parents overall want the best for their kids and they want to be protect. There's a real impulse to be protective. Um, and it is doesn't if you didn't, and most people did not get good sex education in their own lives when they were growing up. So it feels like a new topic. It feels like the schools are trying to do something different. I think for some people it feels like there are values being imposed on them um, that they don't agree with or that they're not sure about. So I think the best place to connect with parents is around protecting kids and establishing a common ground. Like we want our kids to be safe. We want them to be protected. Um, and that's where you want to start with a point of connection. And then look at this, try to share some evidence around like what actually works and what actually reduces sexual assault, what reduces sexual risk taking. Um, and letting people see being transparent, letting people see the materials that you're going to use to teach. Often people hear about things in the news or hear about it from a friend, and they get ideas in their head that like you're going to come into class in ninth grade health class and they're just going to start showing porn films. And it is very not like it's really different than that. And so sometimes actually just listening to people, hearing their fears or concerns, and being honest about what are you, what are we actually going to teach, and treating them as partners, saying, hey, we're going to be talking about how pregnancy happens in class. We just talk about it from a factual point of view. Um, we don't teach about values around that, or around when should somebody become pregnant, or should they, how do you decide to have a child or not? And what do you do if you become pregnant? Like, you have different options. What are you, those are all values choice decisions that, um, it's not the school's job to teach what's right and wrong in that case, but you as parents at home, that's a great place to have those conversations around what are your values around, like, what would you like to have in place in someone's life before they decide to have a baby, or um, what are your beliefs around the legality of abortion, or whatever the issues are. Um, Families should have conversations about those values, and the fact that they're coming up as an issue in class um, is a great time to kind of lean on that as your excuse for why to bring this up and why to share your thoughts around it. And yeah, that's where I would go.
That's such a great answer. I really appreciate that. It's seems like a good approach to start with empathy and connection. It's not my go-to often, but I like it. uh, yeah, it's so interesting. Like that distinction between like information and values is so it's like it's so interesting that it doesn't feel that that distinction was not intuitive to me because the Southern Baptist churches I was brought up in and like the ideology around abstinence only sex education is like it puts such a moral valence on information. And I do think information does have a moral valence. Like it's a moral consideration to me to give people information and to make sure people have complete good information. But like it doesn't have to be. Like it's just information at the end of the day.
That is really interesting because you grew up in Alabama and you were Southern Baptist. So I was at 12, 7th grade, I joined the Mormon church. Strong purity culture. But I went to Los Angeles Unified School District. So we had very science-based, health education that was completely the experience that I had were completely separate, right? The value part of it came from the church and the education scientific fact of it came from school. And then my mother was not Mormon, so she was she was in between. Like she didn't want me running around being a wild child, because she was, just her age, me, whatever. She doesn't think that's a safe thing to do, maybe, but it wasn't couched in that whole religious thing, it was more, and honestly, when she said wanted to talk about it, I was just like, yeah, I got it. I don't want to talk about it. Yeah. But
There's
it's interesting. Your experience in school would have been pretty probably consistent with what you were learning at church.
there's such a charge around sexual topics, that sometimes it's useful for me to make comparisons with other topics that seem to have less emotional charge. So the
Mhm.
one that comes to mind is around drinking, and that many parents, when I talk to them, they're like, "Oh, I really don't want my kids to drink." They have some values around that, and they also want their kids to be alive. So um, it is pretty common for people to have messages around drinking, like, "I wish you wouldn't drink. Let me tell you about, we now incorporate a lot of message around the teen brain and why it's particularly harmful to have a lot of substance use when your brain is developing." So
Mhm.
incorporating some of that messaging, um, and to just share those values. But also they say, like, if you're going to drink, um, I definitely don't want you to drive a car, and I don't want you to get in a car with someone who's drinking because I want you to be alive at the end of the night.
But so often as parents, I was this way. I'm sure my children will be with their children, is no questions asked. Anytime, day or night, you call, you need me, I'll be there.
Yeah.
Right?
So that kind of, I think I think teenagers can handle that kind of message. Um, and when it comes to sexuality, like those same kind of things come up where you're sharing some information, like how
Hmm.
alcohol can affect you if you're driving and what you want to do to stay safe. Um, and you can still share your values around teenage drinking overall. Um, and those kind of, I think people could do a better job of incorporating this kind of um, a mix of messages around sexuality where you're providing information like, and maybe it is. I would prefer that you waited until some event in your life or some age to be sexually active, but I want you to know about birth control. I want you to know how pregnancy works or how sexually transmitted infections are go from one person to another so that you can protect yourself if you do decide um, to be sexually active with other people. Um, and all of that can go together. And sometimes saying to parents, like, you actually already do this kind of messaging around alcohol and drinking,
Hmm.
um, helps them feel more comfortable with it.
That makes sense. It's also really interesting. A couple years ago, National Review posted an article like in bemoaning the end of the backseat teenage hookup. Like we went full circle from like moral panic around premarital teen sex and teen pregnancy to like the good old days of the shotgun wedding. And I do think it's really interesting that we have this huge moral panic around, teenagers finding out about adult things in an era where teenagers are drinking less, having less sex, uh, and all markers of like late adolescence. They're getting their driver's license later. They're getting their first job later. Like this is just like polling in social science, but like do you think that that's overblown? Do you think these are real trends? Like, what do you think about that?
Oh, that feel all of those feel very true. Like teenagers are taking fewer risks, and even things that feel sometimes silly, like going and ringing someone's doorbell or answering the phone. Like people will make jokes about those being feeling scary. Um, that and when you're talking about dating, like the amount of anxiety that comes up around actually approaching someone and asking for their number or talking to them in real life, that is real. Um, and I think sometimes it comes from just a lack of practice. People are spending a lot of time on their phones and not hanging out in real life as much. Um, and then with boys, we have boys really heard the messages around Me Too and sexual harassment, and um, they largely, say like, "Oh, I don't want to be a creeper. Um,
Mm.
I don't want to be sexually harassing someone," and that's good. Like, I don't want them to be sexually harassing anyone either. But
But they
sometimes that
can't identify the line of where it's just, I like you, I'd like to hang out with you, and being a creeper.
exactly. Like,
Yeah.
um, there's sometimes a sense of that just being attracted to someone or feeling horny or like um having a sense of sexual desire, that somehow that is shameful or something to not talk about. And so I think there's a need to kind of clarify that of to say like it is okay to like someone, it's okay to approach someone and say that you like them. um and let's practice how to do that in a way that is respectful and where you have some sense of, don't go up to somebody who's like reading a book with their headphones on, and clearly doesn't want any any other attention. But how to read cues for somebody who might be open to an interaction, and then how to respond if they're not interested. Like if you, it is totally fine to make a request and say like, "Hey, you seem like a really nice person," or you're really cute. I'd love to hang out sometime." And then if they say, "No, I'm not interested," take the no and don't take it as like sometimes boys get this idea like, "Oh, it's a challenge and I'm gonna keep trying."
You
And
mean that hasn't changed yet?
Well, I think that's somebody pointed this out at some point, and that's kind of the irony of all this is that I do think that generally speaking, like sexual harassment and violence is not stigmatized enough. It is too normalized. I think that's true. And I think Me Too was a reaction to that. I think it was a reaction to the fact that we assume that 30% of accusations of sexual assaults are false when it's well under 10%. It was a reaction to the fact that, like, the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, abusers face absolutely zero consequences. So, like, Me Too is super important and necessary. And generally speaking, the kind of men you need to worry about aren't put off by Me Too. They're not put off by sexual assault and sexual harassment being stigmatized. They don't care. They are not going to be dissuaded by anything except being physically prevented from perpetrating. And as you say, the kind of boys who and men who we need to encourage to take risks, like, they're put off by it. So it's kind of an
But isn't
unfortunate
that
thing.
the way it kind of always is, right? The people who need to learn the lessons seem to never learn the
Often.
lessons, and the
Often.
people who um who don't think, oh, this is directed at me, I need to be extra conscientious, more careful, right? And then they're people who are less likely to enter into healthy, happy relationships with people in their teen years where, where they're learning how to interact with people they might be attracted to, where they're having fun and doing fun things and being respectful to one another, all those things that you want people to have relationships, build healthy relationships as they are going through adolescence. They're the people who are less likely to interact with
yeah,
their peers.
I worry about the decline in hangout time and dating among
Hmm.
teenagers because I do feel like those are skills that people really practice and get better at with practice, and um, having some low stakes things around practice or around consent and just making arrangements with someone. You know, if you're 15 years old and you can't drive and you want to go out with someone, it takes a fair amount of effort to figure out how to do that because you probably don't have much
Hmm.
money. You have to figure out your transportation. You have to figure out a place that will let you in. Like a lot of places, 15-year-olds aren't allowed to go. So if
Hmm.
you're trying to, you have to think it through. You have to do some planning. All of that's good practice for actually dating as an adult.
just
And
just being a just being an adult,
being a person in the
regardless,
world.
right?
um,
Well,
and
yeah, you don't want, I haven't had a teenager for a long time, and I'm about to have teenage grandchildren, and the idea that, and I don't know if this is actually true, but it seems easy to kind of hook up. Like, that would be an easier way through a phone connection, or I don't know. It's just seems, yeah, they're missing out on some social skills if they're not able to.
I think that I mean that as far as meeting people, that's definitely the way that most adults meet now for if they're trying to have a relationship, either a short-term or long-term relationship, that's how people meet each other.
Mhm.
Um, but at some point, you're going to actually be in the room with another human being, and that having that be a enjoyable experience. You have to negotiate if it's a date where you're going out to a place to eat. You have to think about like where are we going? Will they have food that I like? What are the person's manners like that I'm sitting with? How do they treat me? And even if it's just a purely sexual connection, if they're like coming over to your house and um, the person shows up at the door, you still have to talk to the person and work things out and make sure that you're doing things that feel safe and comfortable and that that you both want to do. That requires a fairly sophisticated sense of um, your own desires and your ability to express those desires and to set limits and boundaries and to assess whether the other person seems like they're going to respect those boundaries before you kind of proceed. And I worry that going right, if people don't have a lot of experience dating and then they go right to apps when they're older, once they get in the room with someone, that there's a lot of places where things could go wrong.
I wonder too about how everything connects. Like, I wonder about how health markers are impacting kids' um, desire and ability to like get out and hang out with friends and go on dates and take these risks. Like, I just read that this, today's American children are less healthy across a bunch of markers than previous generations. So, obesity, sleep apnea, diabetes, like all these markers of health are down for American children. And I mean, I think it's harder to like want to go on a date and want to have sex and want to get a job and want to get your driver's license if you're like sick. But I feel like we always just talk about like phones and culture when we talk about these things, but I don't think that they're disconnected. Well, we've got like 2 minutes. I want to keep it to an hour because you're on vacation and I don't want to take up too much of your vacation time. Um, I would have liked to have taken questions, but I didn't get on the ball soon enough. I don't think we really have time for a lot of questions from our viewers. Thank you guys for coming. Is there anything you want to leave people with?
I mean, I think overall, sometimes I hear people talk about teenagers almost like they're another species, and like they, like they express a lot of fear, or like I can never understand teenagers, or you tell them that you're a teacher, and they're like, oh, I could never do that. And I would just encourage people to kind of recognize like teenagers are people, and they're people who are trying to learn about the world, and they are people. Sometimes it's helpful to imagine them 10 or 15 or 20 years in the future as somebody who might live in the house next to you, or somebody who might be in a relationship with a child that you care about right now. And we, their parents are important, but as a community, like we all need to take care of our teenagers and help them grow to be adults that we would want to live next to, where we'd want to have spending time with someone who we care about, or taking care of our kids, or doing just being in community with. Um, so not to be afraid of teenagers, to try to enjoy them. I think they're fascinating and hilarious, and I encourage people to like spend some time with teenagers and in a loving and appreciative way, and try to help give them some guidance, and try to just enjoy them.
Yeah, I think we really need more opportunities for teenagers to spend time with adults who aren't their parents and aren't trying to sell them anything.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Super important.
Thank
All right,
you
thank you so much.
much.
It was wonderful.
This is my
Thank y'all for coming.
first Substack live. Thank you for letting me try it.
Murdered it.
Well, I've got
You're natural.
two pre-sales of books going out to my daughters who have boys.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
So it wasn't all for naught.
This is great. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Have a good vacation. Bye, y'all.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.